Crosby. Welcome in. We are continuing Unit 3 and the understanding of the presidency and what it is. But before we start, I want to take a look at where we are in the race for the presidency. We looked at this before we left class. 270towin.com is a great website to look at. And once again, the president is not elected based on a national popular vote, but state by state popular vote determines the electoral vote of each state. And so it's a perversion of the system. We've covered this extensively. But effectively within each state, like Texas has 40 votes for the president of the United States. And those 40 votes, sorry about that, we do not want Little Shrimp. Those 40 votes are going to be determined by a popular vote in Texas. And the way that works is whichever candidate gets one more vote in Texas is effectively going to win the 40 votes that Texas has. And so as you see on 270 to win here, a lot of your states are already kind of predetermined based on what is likely going Republican and what is likely going Democrat. We see over here California, the Democrat most likely will win California. There's not going to be much of a battle there. However, it's really these small kind of bronze states, grayish states here in the middle, that these are the toss-up states, the battleground states. This is where a lot of your money is going to be placed. This is where your candidates will go. And so as we continue to go into the 2024 election and find who's going to poll well, the two parties are really going to look at not so much who's polling well in Texas or who's polling well in Montana or even who's polling well in California. They're going to look at who's polling well in Wisconsin, who's polling well in Pennsylvania. That's really going to be the telltale on who is going to win this next 2024 election. The other big bugaboo is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is still a very dynamic player in this election. The question is, if Donald Trump does continue to consolidate the majority of the Republican Party around him, will the Republicans as a party kind of consolidate around Donald Trump? Or will Donald Trump cause a split in the party like what we saw in 1912 with Woodrow Wilson winning because Roosevelt and Taft split the party, or 1992, where we saw Bill Clinton winning because Ross Perot and H.W. Bush split the party. And so there's a lot of intrigue with the presidential election kind of coming into this. Today, we're going to look at the Article 2 section of the presidency, where it begins to outline what is the declared authority or declared power of the president. And this is something that's really important because a lot of times what the president runs on is not really what the president gets elected on, or what the president has to do, rather. And so, in other words, the president has to tell the American people, as president, I'm going to do this and this and this and this. And 9 times out of 10, what the president says they're going to do, they don't actually have the power to do. Meanwhile, there's this other realm of authority and power the president has, but because most people don't really understand it, we really don't hear a lot about it when it gets into the elements of the campaign and whatnot, and that's in foreign policy. Now, we'll bring up foreign policy with a very general statements like might makes right, or, peace through strength, and some of these nonsensical phrases. But foreign policy really is a whole different ball of wax that extensive areas of study have been dedicated to it. And so we really kind of have to look at how does the presidency really play into this arena of foreign policy, because ultimately that is going to tell us why we're in Iraq and Afghanistan. So Section 2 here says the president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and militia of several states when called into actual service of the United States. In other words, we have this idea that the president is commander-in-chief. He is the one that makes safe the castle. This is one that I've argued that is important. We must understand that the president's key role, the key function of the presidency, of the executive power, is to make safe the castle. This is where you get from the oath of the office of from all enemies, foreign and domestic. The executive responsibility carries this responsibility of kind of holding peace within our nation, protecting against riots and threats and thievery and murder and all these kind of other things, but also protecting the nation itself from exterior threats or outside threats. And so we're going to look at how that role, this kind of foreign policy role, has really empowered the presidency over the last 150 years. A couple things about the president before we start is the president has to be a civilian. This is something that a lot of people have been quite controversial on, because people are like, well, if he's the leader of the army, should he not be a military personnel himself? The answer is no. The founding fathers feared a standing military. Remember, one of the issues with the Revolutionary War is that the army was permanently stationed in Boston, and people had to house the army. And so one of the things we thought was a bad idea is having a standing military, having a standing army. Now, things are different today, obviously, and we actually have this strong kind of affirmation of the military. But in the time of the writing of the Constitution, we really feared a standing military. And overwhelmingly, we did not want a military leader emerging as a national leader because of people like Julius Caesar, because of people like Napoleon, because of the time after time after time, we saw a military leader take military power and take over or usurp the more foundational elements of government in lieu of their military might that can overwhelmingly conquer any republican form or element. Again, think Napoleon, think Julius Caesar. And so for that reason, we wanted to put the hands of the government in the hands of somebody more tact. Now, could they be military? Absolutely. George Washington was a military leader, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler. We have several historically, Theodore Roosevelt, overwhelmingly. So we have several historically that have been military leaders, but it is not required. And so we have this little thing where sometimes it does play in, but not every military leader is presidential quality. And so remember, that was once again the role of the Electoral College. The Electoral College was supposed to there we go. My pen is coming down. My Electoral College, their role was to narrow this down and figure out, if we do have somebody with military experience, who can we trust not to use that experience and their position in the military to abuse the nation. The other thing when it comes to war is, even though the president is given the power to make safe the castle, a check on that power is that only Congress has the authority to declare war. The president cannot declare war. Right? We cannot go into war unilaterally with the president. Now, that comes with a qualifier, because we have actually not declared war since June 5th, 1942. World War II was the last time we actually declared war. Since World War II, we have seen overwhelmingly the presidents have kind of unilaterally taking us into war. And we're going to look at that. That indicates a growth in the presidential power. So this was supposed to be a check on the presidency that does not seem to be functioning as a check today. Law professor and author Eric Posner argued, he says, when it comes to war making, Congress generally bows to the might of the president. In other words, in the iterations of presidency and power that the president has, historically speaking, though the president did not initiate the presidency with this power, the role has emerged, the role has evolved, and the role today is much different. Now, the president does depend on Congress for military spending. So even if the president does take us into war, he is still hamstrung by whatever the congressional allotments or allowances are. However, because of this bully pulpit and the president's ability to use public narratives, anytime Congress doesn't, quote unquote, fund the military, then we can get this kind of back and forth politicking between the president accusing the Congress of not being sympathetic to our military personnel and our veterans. And Veterans Day is coming up. And one of the things we do not want to be accused of in America is not being friendly to our military, to our veterans. And so even though Congress does get to hold the purse strings, to cut military funding runs a risk of being accused of some unforgivable sins in America. And so, one of the big things we need to understand going into this narrative is the evolution of the role. And so, it's not a role that was originally, because if you look at the evolution of the role, we have to look at the American president as commander in chief, the person who makes safe the castle. Well, in 1787, the castle of the United States was this. I mean, that's effectively it. I mean, you have an eastern seaboard that you have to protect from. You have a western territorial border that you have to protect from. You have the Spanish here in the south that aren't really much of a threat now, but America's still painfully weak. And so we do have to be considerate of that. We also have the British that are still in Canada. Canada's going to emerge largely based on British influence, and so they still celebrate the War of 1812 on our side. Canada celebrates it as a war from independence or from American dominance, because the British really kind of continue to grow and develop in British Canada. They resist the American expansion into Canada and the American attempt to control Canada. I mean, arguably the biggest threat in 1787 following the Constitution is colonists themselves. If you remember, early in American history, the two biggest arguments or the two biggest kind of events are Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion happened before the Constitution, a group of military veterans kind of rising up against the government, and following the Constitution, we had the Whiskey Rebellion, and the Whiskey Rebellion was put down by George Washington. George Washington was the only president historically to actually mount a horse and ride into battle with his troops. And so we have these kind of colonists, and with this revolutionary fervor, this kind of revolutionary sentiment, we really are fearing the colonists may be the biggest threat in 1787. And so it was very clear that the presidential role, as it emerged in our nation, is, yes, to protect Americans from foreign influences that may seek to weaken our nation or attack our nation. But the president also has to protect our nation from unbridled passions of the colonists themselves, of Americans. Sometimes Americans are the biggest threat. And if you juxtapose this with the sentiment in America that we should popularly elect the president, well, how can a popular election of the president elect a president that needs to put down popular sentiment that is anti-American? This creates a conundrum. This creates a problem. And once again, we see it's more of an ignorance of the position that has allowed ourselves to kind of be taken into where it is today. Today, this is a more accurate view of the world. It's not an American nation that is confined to 13 colonies. It's an American nation that leads the world in foreign policy agreements and details. It has so since World War II. So we have this kind of like comedic cartoon here. Norway and Sweden up here, UK going through Brexit and changing, Europe kind of falling apart with all kind of geopolitical considerations, Turkey caught between the West and the East, the Middle East, which is a ball of wax in and of itself, Africa, which is continuing to grow and develop and mature and kind of recognize itself in the modern world. There are so many geopolitical considerations going on in the world that the president has to manage them all. In truth, if the president actually paid attention effectively to foreign policy, he wouldn't have time to usher an opinion on abortion. And so when you start really understanding the role of the presidency, it becomes kind of absurd how much time in these debates is spent on things that the president simply doesn't have the power to control or do. This is from the Economic Forum Institute. They put this together every year. It's a report on the most significant crises in the world. So they do a full-scale analysis of the world, and they put together what are the biggest destabilizing threats in the world right now. And as of, I think this is poll 2022, they argued that it's actually large-scale involuntary migration that is the biggest threat. And if you notice all of these kind of connective tissues here, that if we have this could lead to state collapse or crisis, which could lead to weapons mass destruction and whatnot. And so when we start looking at these things, I love this picture of global policy because it argues that it's not just one thing we have to be cognizant of. It's many things and and many things can lead to other things. And so we keep circling, well, we got to be aware of a nuclear Russia or a nuclear Iran, or we have to make sure China's not cheating. It's not the one thing we have to, be cognizant of. It's the one thing and all the other things that thing leads to. Even simple stuff that we can't control, like extreme weather events. What happens there? What happens if we actually have an extreme weather event lead to a food crisis and a water crisis in the world? Do we start seeing outright rebellions and war over natural resources? And this is something that is very, very possible and has happened in the past and honestly will happen in the future. Even the United States and the southern border, we're already having major water crises hit, and we're already seeing threats of violence between neighbors and friends over who controls water rights. And so this becomes a major element of destabilization. So oftentimes, even though foreign policy is looked at only from the lens of nuclear war or violence or invasion, it's a lot of these other things that can really cause mass destabilization. Down here at the bottom, cyber attacks and technology. One of the humorous things for the last couple presidents we've had is honestly on the face just how I hesitate to use the word ignorant, but how out of touch they seem to be with how technology actually functions. Even Donald Trump's use of Twitter would beg the question on whether the president of the United States should be that active on social media, just from a perception point of view, from a security point of view. Should the president have that type of power? And even so, even if the president should have it, should that power be put in the hands of somebody who doesn't understand how to steward it? If a tweet can cause a mass destabilization, during Barack Obama, the issue in Benghazi, can a YouTube video, something that was put out on social media, something that did stimulate frustration and hatred and led to the death of several Americans, should that have ever been put out? Should that have been a breach of security? And then when the follow-up of that, the president of the United States and his team effectively lied to the American people about what caused that, trying to redirect blame, and somewhat effectively, because most Americans simply didn't know where Benghazi was, how embassies work, and just the absurdity that a YouTube video alone could cause such violence. And so there was a lot more going on in Benghazi, but like I said, most Americans simply don't understand the complexities of foreign policy, which is why presidential candidates don't talk about it, and why they don't get in the minutia of what's on the board. Even if we narrow this down to the Middle East, the Middle East is a complicated arena in and of itself, with a lot of different warring factions and things. Now, most people understand the differences in the Islamic tradition between the Sunni and the Shiites rather, but it's more complicated than that, because not all Sunni gets along and not all Shiite get along. And there's also another sect in Islam that is trying to reform Islam, take Islam through a modern reformation, and they are being cut down, they're being hunted out. There are fundamentalists that do not want to see this happen. And so there's a lot going on even in the Middle East that we have to pay attention to, because there are threats. And if we're going to understand the presidency, we have to understand what exactly is going on in the world and what is America trying to accomplish. Why does America have troops everywhere in the world? And if you look at, we have troops specifically on the battlegrounds where we have once fought. If I draw Western Europe and Eastern Europe, that used to be Berlin Wall, we still have tons of troops right here guarding that line between the West and the East. We have a lot of troops here in the Middle East, except for this vacancy here, which is Iran. And my humble estimation is this: I do not think that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan had anything to do with Iraq and Afghanistan. I think it was a broader effort to slowly bring market forces from India and Indochina into India, into Pakistan, and really kind of begin pressuring the last holdout of what we would consider a fundamentalist Islamic regime. The other thing over here is in the 70s, we went through Egypt and Israel, and we pushed left. Right now, we decided to pull out of the Middle East for a variety of reasons, but it's not by accident that after we pull out of the Middle East, we see problems here, right, with Russia invading Ukraine, and we see problems here, right, with the current issue in Israel, we see problems in Turkey, right? We see problems here in the northern front of Afghanistan. We see problems emerging here. So where we were trying to push in and stabilize, since we kind of bailed before stabilization, we're seeing an undoing of this broader I would say geopolitical strategy that the American presidents had been negotiating, I would argue, since World War II. And so what we're going to do really over the next few lectures is try to understand what exactly is America about. Are we the policemen of the world? Should we be the policemen of the world? I'm going to argue that, yes, we are the policemen of the world by choice. I'm also going to argue that we need to be, that the world needs a police force for a very particular reason, and not for the reason you think. The world needs a police force because of everything you love is tied to some type of police force happening. In other words, McDonald's and Walmart and Target are all made possible because of the Americans acting as a police force in the world. If you do not believe me, go to the grocery store, go to the supermarket, go to the mall, and find anything made in America. It's just not there. We have created a world that is interconnected based on commerce. And if you're going to interconnect the world based on commercial exchange, you have to protect the shipping routes. So America being the policeman of the world isn't this kind of altruistic kind of like we're going to go and protect and defend the world. It's more of a sophisticated understanding of what the market economy provides. It's our base understanding that believes that market exchanges and commercialisms is a best way to initiate arguments of peace. If we can get nations dependent on each other, we build peaceful exchanges, right? But if this is going to be the argument, I have to make the argument. So if we look at America, there's a series of international conflicts that America is going to be involved in. And we're going to go through these series over the course of 2 lectures. First off, original isolationist, the sentiment that says America should not get involved. Then we're going to look at the War of 1812, the war we lost. This is incredibly misunderstood, but we need to go through it because it is incredibly important to America's growth and development. Then we're going to take a look at the Monroe Doctrine, named Monroe once again after the President of the United States. We're going to look at Hawaii, Cuba, Philippines, and the Roosevelt Corollary, once again named after the President of the United States. We're going to look at World War I and World War II, specifically what was the presidential role in World War I and World War II. I'll give you a hint here. In World War I, we rejected our president. In World War II, the president did not allow himself to be rejected. And this is going to kind of shape America in the modern iteration. We're going to look at the Cold War. What was it? Why was it? And how did it come to an end? And who's really responsible for ending the Cold War? And how was it ended? And there's going to be some people that really just need credit that don't. That's just Gorbachev, by the way. H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev are so incredibly important to the end of Cold War, and they hardly get any say because they were both voices of peace. They actually rallied dissenting voices within their own nations because each nation kind of wants their conquering hero. And neither H.W. Bush nor Gorbachev, I would say Pope John Paul II actually had a lot to do with the end of the Cold War as well. Even though Reagan and Thatcher, these kind of like big kind of stout conservatives take credit for the Cold War War actually does not end until after their kind of tutelage of their nations. And then we're going to look at the modern age on terrorism and what we're actually trying to prevent and why leaving Iraq and Afghanistan may be a horrible idea. So we're going to begin at the beginning with Washington. Washington, quote, he said, "Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none or very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the cause of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by the artificial ties and the ordinary vicissitudes of our politics, or the ordinary combinations and collisions of our friendships or enmities. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course." In other words, what Washington is saying here is that we are detached, we are distant. We should not get involved in European politics. That if we're going to look at the U.S. on a map, the U.S. is on a map, and we have all kinds of open opportunity to the West, and we have nothing but war and conflict to the east. Right? And the reason why is because Europe has had a set of primary interests, which has caused Europe to be fighting ever since the fall of Rome. Ever since the fall of Rome, we've had factional groups and territorial spats and national arguments happening in England. If you get involved in English politics, you end up having to take a side on a battle that you really don't understand. And Washington is looking at this battle and saying, we don't want to get involved. Just don't. It's too big of a mess. Stay out of it. Therefore, it is unwise in us to get involved in European politics. And so Washington is going to be in some ways kind of the original isolationist of just don't get involved, stay out of it, let's push west, let's actually develop our nation west. And I would argue that Washington in this sense is a bit naive. I don't think isolationism was a reasonable strategy in 1787. I still don't think it is today for a lot of reasons that we'll have to unpack. But after Washington's presidency, there's a reason that even though Washington was beloved, Washington was one of the most revered individuals in American history, the economy under Washington struggled. This is something that Alexander Hamilton really rose to fame of trying to fix the economy, trying to fix the American banking system, trying to fix financial systems. Washington was great at architecture. He was great at design. He was great at leadership. He was great at a lot of different things, but America struggled financially and could not get our economics underway. Why? Because following the American Revolution, right, what British did is they cut us off from the world. They said, fine, America was developed because of this exchange of markets that was going on between the old world and the new world in America. That this exchange of market ideas was keeping things coming into America, and then America was shipping things to the world that was being purchased by all these European nations. Well, what America had done is, sure, we declared our independence and we won. So fine, congratulations, United States, you control that. But in doing so, right, Britain, the nation that we had defeated, they controlled all of this. Right? British had emerged as the most powerful nation on the planet. So what is going to happen following the American Revolution is, as the American ships try to go out into no man's land and bring goods and services over here, they are going to be intercepted by Britain, and Britain is going to begin taking our ships, taking our vessels, and denying us any access to trade all the way up and down the coast. In other words, our economy is going to suffer simply because our trade is going to get cut off in a lot of different ways because Britain does not recognize our independence as a nation. They're going to use economic forces to try to force America back into submission. And this is something that a lot of Americans simply don't understand. We jump from the American Revolution, and then there's this big gap between the American Revolution and the Civil War. Like, we are so quick to jump to the study of the Civil War, we miss a lot of really important information that happens between the American Revolution and the Civil War. And some of this is in the early 1800s, late 1700s, on just how America is going to survive in the world. Now, we don't have trade with the East yet because we haven't pushed that far. We really are this little bitty nation here, right? We've been cut off for trade north of us because that's controlled with France, or that's controlled by British. Now, we were controlling things with France, but remember, very quickly in the late 1700s, France emerges in their own revolution. So a lot of the war-torn French falls off. So what we hope to have a benefit of France, we don't get that. We can't come into internal Europe because Britain can blockade all the ports. Right? Spain is another issue because it's engaging in its own civil war. And so Europe falls into a mess, and Britain is really the nation you have to have on your side in order to gain economic viability in Europe. And Britain is the nation that we just destroyed. So at least at home. And so there's a problem here, and the problem leads us to direct conflict with Britain. The War of 1812 is the conflict between the Americans and the Britons over these kind of proxy wars, side wars, economic wars that we have leading up to these issues. The XYZ affair falls into this one. The proxy wars fall into this argument. There are a lot of things happening between 1787 and War of 1812 that forced the Americans to foolishly declare war on Britain. Yes, we declared war on Britain. Britain was playing kind of smug, and what was happening is when we were sending ships over to Britain for economic viability and try to increase trade, the Britain would basically take over the ship, steal all the goods, and impress the soldiers. Now, impressment of Navy seamen means that they would basically kidnap the seamen, put them on their own naval vessels, and force them to go fight somewhere in Africa or India or whatnot. So we were literally having Americans kidnapped, American goods stolen, and we really didn't have a resolve. I mean, we kept saying like, hey, you Britain, stop doing this. Like, you stop doing this. You need to stop doing this. And Britain is kind of like looking at us like, okay, you want us to stop doing this? Come make us. You Americans, you beat us there in your own backyard. All right, congratulations. We control all of this. All right, so if you're going to be your own nation and you're going to be all grown up on your own, then bring it. If you're going to make us stop, then make us stop. All right, bring it. And so the United States kind of fought this battle for years, and they finally were like, you know what, we can't really do that, so what are we going to do? This is the grand strategy of Americans. We decided to, wait for it, invade Canada. Yeah, that's right. We invaded Canada. And we invaded Canada with a bunch of old retired generals from the American Revolution. They had not led a troop into battle in some years, and so we had 3 attempts invading Canada, and this is one of the most disastrous invasions in all of world history. As brilliant as the American Revolution turned out for us, the War of 1812 was a disaster in every way possible. After we invaded Canada 3 separate times, trying to bend the Canadians to our will, that forced Britain to send troops over into America. They're actually going to invade a small kind of landing army that's going to move up and march into Washington, D.C. Our president at the time, President Madison, and his wife, Dolly Madison, actually have to flee for their lives. So in the War of 1812, we have this phenomena that America invades Canada, fails miserably. We are falling apart at the seams. Our economy and financial system is a mess. And our president is literally on the run for his life. Britain is in the point of saying, we have effectively watched America crumble before our eyes, and we are going to reassert control of America. And like I said, for all intents and purposes, they've invaded our nation. They've taken over our capital. If this is capture the flag, they've won. So Americans are going to really kind of be at risk of losing everything they've worked for, and Britain is well on their way of taking it back. So Britain brings in more, and they're going to come in through Baltimore, Maryland. They're going to bring in the big guns. They're going to bring in the big ships. They are going to show Americans just how pathetic we are, which leads to one of the most storied battles in all of American history, the Battle of Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry sits in Baltimore Harbor, and an individual American by the name of Francis Scott Key was a lawyer that was hired to do a prisoner exchange off a British vessel. And so Francis Scott Key is parlayed onto this British vessel, and he's there to kind of negotiate the exchange of this American. And the British captain essentially says, hey, wait, I'm going to bomb your nation. We'll get to your prisoner exchange later. And so Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer, penned a poem that had him watching his own nation being bombed. And we happen to sing that poem before every major event in America since its adoption as our national anthem. Now, even though we argue that the Star-Spangled Banner is this kind of like high patriotic song and every sporting event we so boldly declared whatnot, what is interesting about the Star-Spangled Banner is this. it does not actually end in a question mark. I got this from HobbyLobby.com. It's a print of the Star Spangled Banner that you can buy, and it's a lie. The whole notion of the Star Spangled Banner is Francis Scott Key is on a British vessel watching his own nation be bombed. He doesn't know if he has a home to go home to. If the flag is flown, as long as your flag is above that fort, your nation exists. There's still hope. If your flag is flown upside down, you're in distress. You're calling from an immediate support from anybody on your side to come help defend that fort. If your flag should go away and a white flag in its place, the fort is lost and you've given up to the enemy. And so Fort McHenry is really important because Fort McHenry was this like last defense of America for a bunch of British vessels to make it into Baltimore Harbor and start making their way up through the Baltimore or the waterways in America to our most critical locations. In other words, some historians argue that this battle is effectively the last defense from American submission to the British. And so what Francis Scott Key is out there is saying, oh, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly hailed at twilight's last gleaming? In other words, dawn's early light, can you see, this red is not going to work on there, is there? Can you see the flag? He is waking up in the morning, right? He is looking for the flag. Is the flag still there? Do I still have a home to go home to? He said, so what proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming. So at the night when the sun set, it was there. All right, the stripes, the stars, they were all there when night set in, right? And then as the night set in, the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting, right? The light that was emitted from those bombs gave proof that the flag was still there. So it was there when the sun set. It was there for the parts of the battle over the night. Now he's saying, oh, say, does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave over the home of the land of the free and the home of the brave? This is actually a question mark. He doesn't know. The grand irony with the American proclaiming this and with Christina Aguilera singing 500 notes on the final is that it's not actually an exclamation. We really don't know. You have to get to the second verse before he figures out whether or not he has a home to go back to. It says, on the shore dimly seen through the mist of the deep, there where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes. What is that which the breeze or the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half concealed, half discloses? So he sees something in the distance. There's something blowing. He sees the fort. The morning light is coming up. There's something waving. He doesn't know what it is yet. He says, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses. Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected now shines in the stream. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner, oh long may it wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. You have to get to the second stanza before you realize that America survives the attack in 1812. And not only do we survive the attack, but oddly, one of the most sophisticated navies on all the planet didn't even land a shot. For whatever reason, they failed miserably at actually doing this. Now, some historians argue that Britain didn't want to land a shot. They just wanted to make a point. Some historians argue that no, was the divine providence. This was God's protection. Some people at the time, overwhelmingly, I would say most of the people at the time, argued the latter, that this was a divine protection of America. And so as we look at what happened at Fort McHenry, it is a major turning point in United States history. As we look at after this, the British government is forced to reconcile a couple things. Number one, they have to decide, do we want to continue fighting Americans? Is this something we want to keep up? Remember, we have had this really brilliant exchange with Americans for some time, and we've cut off that exchange, right, primarily to prove something to ourselves and to the Americans. Well, yes, Europeans and English individuals, British individuals, they did hurt America in the cutoff of trade, but they also hurt themselves. They cut themselves off from free-flowing goods from America, and that's what capitalism provides. Capitalism provides a system where if you build the economic interchanges, yeah, if one person should abuse the other one, that other one will get hurt, but eventually the person benefiting from that exchange on the other side, the one doing the abuse, will be hurt as well. And so Britain has to kind of figure out what's more important here, to make their stands against America or to consolidate with America, settle on terms, and actually agree to negotiations. The other thing is Napoleon is rising in France and beginning to take over Europe as well. And so in some ways, Britain is caught between we've got bigger fish to fry here in Europe, and most of our forces, not most of our forces, but a good percentage of our forces over in America. So Britain decides after the after the Battle of Fort McHenry to effectively consolidate with, not to consolidate, but to reconcile with America. We kind of look at them and they were like, okay, y'all beat us, we beat you, friends, call it even. And we're like, okay. And so we effectively do. We make peace with the English, and we have been best friends with England ever since. So much of the American tradition is English tradition. So much of American law is English law. And so much of what America does in the world is a continuation of what Britain had started. And I think it's very important for us to understand that Britain is going to kind of take a back seat, but America is really going to begin champion this kind of growing economic sentiment of our job is to guarantee peace of economic exchanges. So when we start looking at this, the next president after Madison is James Monroe, which leads to the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was this argument of the president saying, effectively, now that we have consolidated with the biggest threat in Europe, we're going to come out here and boldly declare that any future expansion is going to be done by Americans, that the British and anybody in Europe can no longer expand anywhere into the New World. That if you don't already have a colony over here, then any expansion into the New World is going to be considered an act of war against Americans. And this is quite bold of us to go out there and tell France and Spain and Portugal that no more expansion in the Western Hemisphere. If we draw a line here, if you don't already have a colony, because Spain obviously already has colonies here and here, France has some colonies, but there's a big part of big open land over here that nobody really has. And America's basically laying claim to all of that land. And we're saying this is ours. And it's being led by none other than James Monroe. Pay attention to the name. Our president, our commander-in-chief, the one making safe the castle, is taking on the whole of Europe here, and he's successful. Mostly because Europe's are fighting each other after the Napoleonic Wars, and they're so weakened at this point, they couldn't do anything even if they want to, but it was a strategic managing of global affairs. And this leads to a lot of arguments today on, has America kind of taken advantage of the globe and the global people? And I would argue to an extent that that could be true. America has shown a willingness to exploit weak moments in other nations. However, what did we do with that? Exploitation just got us control. What we did with those nations following it, I think that tells a very different story than us just going in for our benefit. Specifically when you look at the American expansion in the Pacific, which we'll talk about a little bit later, on so many of those nations being grateful long-term or being prosperous long-term. Hawaii is a great example of this. Simultaneously, Hawaiians hate and love America. On one side, they hate us because we effectively took over their island nation, used it to our benefit for a military base in the Pacific, right? And so a lot of people believe that we fundamentally took over the purity of Hawaii, but Hawaii has economically boomed based on its connection to America and the amount of money and finance and stability that has been brought into that island because of its connection to America. And so there's always this kind of bittersweet element that happens in Hawaii. Nonetheless, kind of back to the Monroe Doctrine, we're looking at this expansion that happens following the War of 1812. We begin and we run. We had Louisiana Purchase that was purchased by Jefferson just before Louisiana Purchase. It's a lot of unorganized, unknown territory. 1848, 1846, 1849, all the Northern Territory. We're going to set this territory line here, the treaty line of 1846, which puts kind of like a northern border. And that border happens to here, and then we renegotiate this one out here of the Oregon Territory in 1848. And so we're going to kind of look at some of these continuing ongoing negotiations with predominantly Britain on what is actually going to happen. Texas is annexed as an independent nation in 1845. Yes, Texas is the only state that was its own independent nation for a significant period of time prior to becoming a state. And the annexation of Texas is really a controversial event. If you take Texas government, the Texas annexation was really a ploy by the United States to take advantage of a weakened Texas and a weakened Mexico, primarily to bait the Mexicans into invading the United States so that they could then claim all of this. California is effectively going to be part of the United States because of what happens in Texas. Utah, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona are all pulled into the United States because of what happens in Texas. So in a sense, even though we kind of look at the Alamo here in Texas and say, well, that was primarily a Texas thing, it wasn't. What happens at the Alamo is going to reverberate through United States history, but it wasn't the best to Texans. It wasn't the best to Mexicans, but the United States really came out of that well based on this kind of Monroe Doctrine that this land, this idea of manifest destiny from sea to shining sea is ours, that we are taking kind of a divine ownership of all of this land. And like I said, then we push further into the Pacific. We push further into Hawaii. This is a petition from the people of Hawaii to William McKinley to try to get the president to not annex. It says, to His Excellency William McKinley, President of the United States, whereas it has been submitted to the Senate of the United States of America, a treaty for annexation of the Hawaiian Islands to the said United States. We, the undersigned native Hawaiian citizens and residents of the District of Honolulu and Oahu, who are members of the Hawaiian Patriotic League, an island and others in sympathy with the League, earnestly protest. There's this notion that a lot of Hawaiians, native Hawaiians, protested this. They did not want to be annexed by the United States. But Hawaii gave us a strategic location. Remember back in the War of 1812. The War of 1812 argued that this exchange is beneficial to all nations within the exchange. However, when Britain started to commandeer troops and impress our soldiers and to steal goods, if you cannot protect what you put on the marketplace, then it doesn't really do you a lot of good to produce goods that have to be bought and sold on the marketplace. And this is something that I think American students fundamentally don't understand is capitalism, marketplace demographics. Right? And this is fundamentally necessarily important to understand what America is trying to do. If I take some of these nations down here, right, there is a commodity down here that is an incredibly valuable commodity. It's called coffee, right? It also grows in this region here, right? There's a certain latitudinal line in the world, right, where coffee can be grown, right? Now, here's the problem. If this temperate or this climate can produce coffee, they cannot possibly consume all the coffee they can produce. Americans, we consume a ton of coffee. We love our coffee, right? That is a coffee cup, and don't say otherwise. That's really bad drawing, Mr. Crosby. I know, right? But we love our coffee, and we'll give it a little steam here and whatnot, all right? There we go, right? However, we can't grow the stuff. Right? Outside of some highly modified kind of growing conditions internally, we cannot grow coffee. So we rely on many of these areas in this latitude range to grow coffee. If we have an established market, then it allows America to say, hey, coffee growers in Guatemala, why don't y'all bring your coffee into America and we'll allow it to be bought and sold on our shelves. Now, we need somebody to protect that exchange. If we're going to get Sumatra is an African country, and we have Sumatran coffee. Why? Because it's grown in Africa. It is then brought from Africa all the way into the United States. Why? Because somebody is protecting the commercial exchange routes. Everything that we are doing in America about being the policeman of the world is going to come back to this understanding of capitalism and that any given nation can produce something in that nation, but they can produce too much for that nation to consume. But if nations would grow an interdependency on each other, then all of these avocados grown in Mexico can be bought and sold elsewhere. So Mexicans don't have to eat all of these avocados. So we have cacao beans and apples and bananas and honey and mutton and all of these things that can be shared by all of these nations. But the moment you create this system, now you have a system of interdependency. Once nations begin fighting or warring, or when a nation cannot trust that the goods that they put on the ocean, if I put something on the ocean, right, that is going to be sent to Europe, if I can't trust that good is going to get there, then we see calamity in the marketplace. And so when I start looking at this, what happens following Hawaii is why? What are we trying to secure in the Pacific? The other area we see conflict in the Gulf of Mexico. The early 1900s, we see the Spanish-American War, we see the Mexican-American War, we see the Panama Canal Initiative. To hell with Spain, remember the Maine. I will tell you, if you're in American history and there's a question on the test, and that question is, what prompted the American involvement in any war? Any war. If there is an answer choice that says a boat sunk, that is the correct answer. Almost every time we have entered into conflict, it started with the sinking of a boat. In the Spanish-American War, it was, to hell with Spain, remember the Maine. The Maine was a boat that sunk off the coast of Cuba, and we actually blame the Spanish for the sinking of that boat. And so what happens is we go in on behalf of the Cubans, and this becomes what we call the Roosevelt Corollary. Remember, James Monroe called the Monroe Doctrine that said any future expansion in the United States is the United States. Well, Teddy Roosevelt expanded that and said, we don't only have rights to all of the unoccupied land, we also have an obligation for individuals in the Western Hemisphere to throw off their colonial oppressors, to get rid of the yoke or the burden of control from their European counterparts. So in Cuba, where Spain had control, it was our responsibility to help the Cubans actually throw off that Spanish control and help them develop a republican form of government, or a government that would, quote unquote, economically exchange with the United States and build friendly connections. One of the reasons why Cuba is still so economically cut off from the United States today is because of this. They don't develop the government in Cuba that can do that. And so we have basically cut them off economically. And we will continue to cut them off economically because it hurts them more than it hurts us. Yeah, we don't get our cigars, but Cuba remains a third world country, primarily because it kind of continues to say, we're going to go about this on our own. We're going to continue offering thing, and we're not going to kind of bend to the might of Americans. And Americans are like, fine, you do you. You be Cuba, but we're going to cut you off economically. Puerto Rico does join the United States. If you're at Virgin Islands, benefits from this. The Panama Canal, of having ships kind of go from this side down through and around. All this has to do with economic viability and economic transportation. Remember, we had this kind of like the railroad was this really big thing in the late 1800s. And then once the Panama Canal kind of begins going around, we see a decline, not an end. We saw very, very, very vibrant railroads today, but we do see a decline in this kind of like attention paid to the railroad. Alaska we get in 1867, Hawaiian Islands we get in 1898, and these are the last two states. But if you notice the expansion and how much America was expanding, it wasn't just Alaska and Hawaii. We're actually going in and putting up all these different things. Guam in 1898, the Philippines in 1898, the American Samoa in 1899. We are building kind of a strategic interplace. Why? Because the intention is, once again, open up economic exchanges with the world. If Europe controls everything over here, if England controls here, then the market that is really open, that leads to the long-term American viability, are the markets of Asia. Those are the markets we're trying to get to. That's the world we're trying to control. So we're basically taking a British model and we're implementing that British model in the Pacific Ocean as opposed to the Atlantic Ocean. We're letting kind of Europeans, primarily Britain, control the Atlantic, and we're expanding over here. But remember, if you're going to build trade routes, you have to protect your trade. So what do we have on all of these things? We have bases. In Hawaii, what do we have? The largest naval base in the Pacific Pearl Harbor. This was not by accident. If you look at Midway, we have a naval base. What did we get from the Philippines? Naval bases. Guam, naval bases. We have outposts. We have refueling posts. We have strategic locations that are expanding all the way through the Pacific. So we can begin building a trading network of ships going in and out that then can be protected by this strategic kind of fleet that we put in the Pacific. This is why it's so important to understand World War II more comprehensively, because World War II, yeah, it's going to have a war in Europe, but the war for America was as much, if not more, the war in the Pacific that we cared about, not the war in Europe. The war in Europe is kind of takes over, but it's really not historically sound. During the time, we were actually more concerned about the advancement in the Pacific than the advancement in Europe, and this is why. At the turn of the 1800s, 1900s, what is often called American imperialism, that we're setting up an empire, I would say that there is some merit to that America is kind of modeling the British. However, what changes is this. When the British did it, they suppressed the population to their will. They used power and might to do that. That power and might caused a lot of those colonial people groups to overturn and override or rebel against the British oversight, right? America's trying to do something similar without infringing on the rights of the people, without frustrating those people to the point that they're going to rebel, which means when America attempts to do this, we're playing with different versions. How can we do this in such a way that gains their friendship, right? But not necessarily their condemnation. And so can we build a friendship with Philippines? Can we bring? So we're going to see the strategic use of international agreements, treaties, international arrangements, international kind of when we get into discussions and agreements and arrangements, we're going to use a lot of international politicking to kind of go into the world and say, we are America. This is what we offer, right? Who wants to be on our team? Right? This is what we offer. Who wants to be on our team? And frankly, most of these nations that have aligned with the United States have grown, not only in stability, but in economic viability as well. And so, as we kind of push into the 1900s, we're going to have a battle between the old war and the new world. This kind of old way of doing things, of territorial expansion and control, and this new way of doing things based on friendships and alliances, and that America can be friends with Guam, and both nations can benefit to the extent that they can produce and provide and give things on the market. Now, Guam cannot be reasonably expected to provide their own military to protect their trading ports. But the United States says, as long as you're willing to produce things, as long as you're willing to create things, we will protect the shipping lines for you. So Philippines, Guam, the American Samoa, y'all just make something and bring it to America, and we'll kind of see what sells and what doesn't sell. So America's kind of modifying the model. We're kind of doing something different here, trying to say we still want to build an economic interdependency, but we don't want to control everything to the point of getting people to revolt. Europe is still territorial expansion and control through might and military, and this is going to come to a head. But we're not going to get there today, right? So I want to end off there with this kind of understanding of America and the world. We are growing, we are expanding, we are slowly but surely building this kind of global presence, but we are not yet the most powerful nation in the world. By the time we get into World War I and World War II, by the end of World War II, we will be the most powerful nation in the world. However, you'll have to wait to the next lecture before we get there. Until then, I bid you all adieu. Any question, comments, concerns, please email them to me. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know what your thoughts are on the lecture. Are they working? Are they not working? Is there something you disagree with in all this? This is a theory built from years of work. So what I do is I put forth the most convincing argument. And when we look at the presidency, we have to see somebody that is managing a global commercial network. work. And that's what the presidency is today, which should cause concerns with the presidential election of 2024. It actually makes the last several elections kind of comical. So nonetheless, we will talk again shortly where we'll actually develop the 20th century and 21st century. Until then, I bid you all adieu.